While people are sort of filtering in and filtering out, I'll just say quickly who I am. My name is Ajay Singh Chaudhary. I'm the Executive Director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and I'm a core faculty member specializing in social and political theory. And the talk that I'm giving tonight is part of a larger work that is about sort of politics of political theory of climate change. And this is a work in progress, and this is unquestionably the weirdest part of that work. And so I kind of thought it was perfect for the night of philosophy, especially given the topic. So I'm actually just going to launch straight in. In April of 2018, the temperature reached 122.4 degrees Fahrenheit, 50.2 degrees Celsius in Nawabshah, Pakistan, a city of 1.1 million people, a mere 127 miles from Karachi. This was not only the hottest April day ever in Nawabshah, it was the hottest April day ever in recorded human history. Many climate scientists who work on this, in some ways the most straightforward social impact of climate change, talk about wet bulb temperatures, a combination of heat and humidity measures when discussing dangerous heat. And for good reason. Wet bulb thresholds are much lower, around 32 to 33 degrees Celsius, and are already being crossed all over the world, and are likely to be crossed much sooner in many places. But even a dry bulb threshold, around 35 degrees Celsius, without the compounding issues, is, quote, dangerous. 50.2 degrees Celsius is, for a few days, maybe even a few hours, deadly. There is so much to think through with an example like this, from the obvious, climate change, rising temperatures and its systemic causes, to the less so, even with mitigation, these are millions of people who will move. But what I wish to focus on for the moment is the temporal aspects of what such blunt empirical realities pose. Horizons fade, a fog descends. Past is churning geologically in the present, while if there is future, it is already here. So many arguments about the Anthropocene, even though consciously people know this not to be the case, pose questions and challenges as if they are about a future about to arrive, before it's too late, to leave a better future for our children or grandchildren, and so on. But the Anthropocene, definitionally, has already been here for some time, and the challenges it poses are as well. A whole way of thinking about time changes. Two of the greatest confusions around climate change are political and temporal. Tonight, my focus is on the second category, time. But the former will loom so largely over our conversation, it's worth introducing up front. It is often assumed that climate change is the issue that finally brings us together, or that faces humanity as a whole. It is often assumed that all people face dire consequences of climate change, that it will be a loss in the ordinary sense of that word to all people. Climate is spoken of apocalyptically, the world will end, and so on. My first intervention here tonight is that none of these positions are correct. There is a stark political divide that characterizes this moment in the Anthropocene. Not everyone will die, only a rather large number of people. It is far more likely that a large number of people will live, just even more miserably so. There are people with a deep investment for immediate gain and long-term payout in a non-mitigation, non-adaptation scenario. Although there are so many stark political divides that I'm sure each and every one of us can imagine, this is almost the quintessentially perfect political divide. It is literally zero-sum. The divide is not, as some would have it, between those who accept and those who reject the overwhelming evidence of climate science. It is about those who stand to gain, both in this moment and in the future as traditionally conceived, from fundamental system preservation, and those whose current, as I term it, systemic exhaustion, is part of the fuel for that system, as much as any fossil fuel or industrial agricultural process. As you can probably already hear, there are different ways of conceiving time already embedded in such a discourse, different presents and different futures. Green discourse tends to discuss the relationship of present and future as the current generation or current interests robbing our children or grandchildren. That the issue is fundamentally that some broad register of the desires of this moment currently outweigh the needs of the future. Tonight, in the brief time that I have, I wish to sketch out the case that this too is an error. The challenge of adaptation and mitigation to climate change is about the here and now. It is not a question about doing something today for hopeful results tomorrow. It is rather a question of fundamental systemic transformation today as the precondition for even thinking about tomorrow. This is not only in terms of the overt characteristics often associated with climate change, atmospheric carbon, soil depletion, ocean acidification, but with the attendant economic, social, and political crises that are internal to our global human ecological niche. These are key sites in which we see the way in which our current global socioeconomic system, in that wonderfully careful language that appears in so much of the climate science literature, is extracting from human systems and the biosphere alike. It is not simply that climate impacts or exacerbates existing inequalities and inequities. Inequality is a key driver of climate change, both in contributing to overall system overheating, but also in the ways in which profits and wealth concentration are the principal forms of political power. Paradoxically, today's needs and today's desires among the vast majority of people on Earth are precisely what we need to fulfill to meet the fundamental technical challenges of climate change. This is true not only in terms of a global north-south divide, but within even the relatively wealthy and well-off global north states as well. It is not about what we can achieve tomorrow. It is a political struggle in this moment. I call this moment the long now. The ecological challenge is so many different ways of understanding time. But I am not interested in moving past these to talk about some true nature of time, to pursue a more metaphysical or existential inquiry, to search for a fundamental ontology of time. This would be to dismiss the everyday effective structure of time. And it is precisely there, in this moment, as a structure which we feel, that the political possibilities and the implications of the ecological are more broadly palpable. The Anthropocene, strictly speaking, is a geological epoch, perfectly understandable within standard linear frameworks of what Walter Benjamin would call empty, homogeneous time. It is visible in the geological record. This standard temporal framework is vital for understanding climate change. The conditions I opened this talk with of Nuwabsha are only knowable through these kinds of temporal measurements. But when we think about this in more historical terms, we reach a limitation. Take another example from the climate science literature. Assuming all carbon emissions magically just stop right now, as I'm speaking, global warming would actually continue. That's what I get for theater. Committed warming is an active, cumulative effect of the history of carbon-fueled economic life. The rate and pace of that continuation would make avoiding some of the worst outcomes outlined in the most recent IPCC report quite probable, if it all stops magically right now. But the warming itself would continue. Committed warming is our history literally haunting us. The ghost of dead labor living on not only in commodities, but in externalities. The past is here, whether we're looking stratigraphically at layers of plastic, signs of increased carbon emissions, or even radiological changes. Similarly, Nuwabsha is likely unlivable. That future is also already here. The long now attempts to capture both the strangeness and the radical potential of this particular moment. The Anthropocene, as an epoch, is here to stay. If all of the most optimistic outcomes come to fruition, we will still be living in a world in which human activity is fundamentally organizing our ecological niche. I am far from the first to note that this time that we're living in feels different. Lauren Berlant, for example, has argued that before it is an object for contemplation, the present is felt, and that currently we exist within an elongated array of the present. Mark Fisher wrote of the long, slow cancellation of the future that accompanied the triumphalist spirit of what he called capitalist realism, and what Francis Fukuyama famously identified as Hegel's end of history. A time in which the hegemonic common sense is that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is not even possible to imagine a coherent alternative to it. Speaking specifically of both the elections here in the United States and a larger sense of a cultural masculinist chauvinist backlash, Dana Terrici writes of the long 2016, right? An election which never seemed to start and never seems to end. Although there are significant differences in all of these authors and positions, there is a sense in all of them of a future forestalled, stolen, waiting to be rekindled, reinvented, or reached, that time has run out. Not only in these texts, but in the social and economic and political crises the world over, we can observe the exhaustion of our moment. that this time feels like it will never end is often presented as a barrier to some unknown future. The heavy blanket of capitalist realism growing more and more threadbare by the day, alongside the weight of particulate matter growing more and more palpable by the day, are changing the stakes of the game. The vertigo one feels.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in the grand lobby for the live podcast of WNYC's 10 Things That Scare Me.
I got 10 things. All right. The vertigo one feels, as we reconstitute our vision of time as truly geological, is not something we should push past, but rather something we should embrace. It is inseparable from the stark presentation of empirical reality, like the heat record in Pakistan and its effect on us. Somewhere between unbridled optimism, the arc of history is long and it bends towards justice, and absolute fatalism, the die is cast and there is nothing you can do, lies the long now. This civilization is over and everyone knows it, writes Mackenzie Wark. The question is, what now? A whole different way of looking not only at the future, but at the present opens up. A flourishing, already latent, possible, potential here, not on some distant temporal horizon. Visions fixed on that horizon lead to a series of analytic and political responses constructed accordingly. A certain morality is preached, and we dutifully place ourselves on Hegel's slaughter bench to sacrifice ourselves for the promise of a future perfect or of a heavenly end. Theological ideas, in particular a Christian ideal of providential history, suffuse dominant modes of thinking about time. Even Marx's materialist history, premised as it is on how ideas themselves are born out of how we produce and procure our wants, needs, and desires, is insufficient for someone like Benjamin. Benjamin writes in one of his most famous lines regarding the angel of history, "His eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his face turned toward the past. Where a chain of events appears before us, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it at his feet." What does this angel see? The angel sees a gigantic pile of detritus, wreckage upon wreckage, not linear theodicies telling us a story of the fall or of future redemption, but layer upon layer of the failure to bring about the messianic condition, which, for Benjamin, is complete and utter emancipation and redemption. Where we see a story, a fairy tale, which justifies today and whose payoff is tomorrow, the angel just sees stuff, stratigraphically. The angel sees a long now, if not this long now. The most recent special report of the IPCC indicates that to implement any plausible adaptation and mitigation scenario, this is a quote, "all mitigation pathways begin now and involve rapid and unprecedented societal transformation," end quote. At this juncture, the horizon is the last place we need to look. Nearly every political ideological construction around time, our temporal common sense, is pointed, sometimes almost comically, away from the present. There are always brighter tomorrows tomorrow, never brighter or different or new todays today. Tomorrow is somehow always today again in political time. Simultaneously, every economic incentive is pointed at maximizing the profit of this very moment. The mainstream macroeconomic approach to climate change, the so-called discount rate, perfectly encapsulates both these ideas. In trying to price in the externality, potential future costs are discounted against present economic need. Economic benefit is to be maximized, i.e. profits, even while a better future is promised. In language which matches much common green discourse, we'll sacrifice a little today, in the form of a largely meaningless added cost, a very modest carbon tax, for example, for an eventual payoff for our children. But a politics for the Anthropocene is a politics of this moment. Whose benefit and whose cost? Whose today and whose tomorrow? One might even ask, as suggested by Ruth Wilson Gilmore's discussion of the divestment in the social reproduction of African American families and community life, whose child? The long now as experience and as concept helps break the grip of providential history, of Hegel's liberal belief in the orderly progress of reason. It is tempting to put this timestamp on the long now. It's not it's the next 2 decades or even the next 12 years. But the long now is not synonymous with rough timelines for implementing sustainable pathways. Part of the urgency and intensity of this moment is born out of the growing realization of facts like these. But the long now as a concept is about a different way to understand time and about a different way that we feel time. Jose Esteban Munoz, in An Imagining of Queer Futurity, talks of another world, right? He wants to sort of shoot there, and it's very beautiful. But what if that other world is not another time? One of the underappreciated aspects of Benjamin's framing of messianic time is that it smuggles in the Jewish idea that the world to come, ha'olam haba in Hebrew, is this world, ha'olam hazeh. It is not bringing heaven to earth, but allowing what is already here to come about at any moment. Only there's an anti-utopian rub. Only the Messiah redeems. You can't make it happen. No cook shops for the future. Benjamin's political theology is unsurprisingly well suited to Marxism. You are not creating the entire world from scratch, but building and transforming from what developed before. The long now may not promise the messianic rupture, but it does still work from the pieces of what is here, all those potentials and possibilities, and that life among the ruins, not to dwell in ruins, but to create another world right here in this one. There is a precedent for this talk of potentiality and creating among the ruins of a world which is passing away. That precedent is modernism. To speak of modernism is to conjure images of industrialism at its worst, or perhaps the European avant-garde at its best. Closer to today, perhaps the super-modernism of architects like Zaha Hadid or Norman Foster, or maybe throwaway IKEA furniture, or the often racially charged and historically muddled visions of public housing blocks, whether here, or in Chicago, or in Moscow, or in London. The current understanding of eco-modernism is even worse. Eco-modernism, as currently deployed, is often a kind of worst of both worlds doubling down on the very real shortcomings of many, but certainly not all, modernist projects. Coming in left and right varieties, eco-modernism imagines the extremes of the bourgeois world, the consumption patterns of the American top 4 or 5% or so, expanded to all human beings everywhere on Earth through technological innovation and a true final domination of nature. This rests on dubious technological assumptions that, against vast evidence to the contrary and already discussed time constraints, literally magic technology will overcome what the climate science literature notes as already exceeded planetary boundaries, and a deep constriction on the most classic question of political philosophy to court: what constitutes the good life? Ironically, eco-modernists on the first count are not particularly ecological, and on the second, not particularly modernist. For all their claims to a kind of rigorous reintroduction of science and engineering into the discussion of climate, their view of aptly described technological miracles is as dubious as the technocrats they often deride. For all their claims to hew to a radical reintroduction of the future, they seem to be unable to imagine any life, any culture, beyond a particular vision of an idealized, wealthy American or perhaps Northern European lifestyle, just writ large, universalized. This is precisely that vision of the good life which constitutes cruel optimism, far greater than simple false consciousness, a holistic vision shot through with emotional resonance from family to economy to society to state. What eco-modernists seem to be missing is that the very people demanding something, anything, different, do not seem particularly interested in this dream world any longer. They are, as a central theme to all my work on politics and the Anthropocene, in a word that occurs with almost unbelievable frequency in contemporary critical literature, exhausted by this life. While some, in understandable contrast to eco-modernism, evoke a kind of eco-romanticism or a middle position of a kind of low modernism, I wish to propose something a bit different without dismissing these out of hand. A real eco-modernism in both the political and aesthetic implications of that term. We do indeed need a concrete utopia, although depending on local conditions, that concrete might be made of compacted fly ash blocks or bamboo, and that utopianism is paradoxically anti-utopian in the best sense of the world. A word. I have in mind rather all those other modernisms, some overlooked, some never achieved, some never dreamt. Think of the black modernism described by Fred Moten as, quote, one of space-time, separated coincidence and migrant imagination, channels of natal prematurity as well as black rebirth, modernism as intranational as well as international relocation. What is more modern and more of a tradition than jazz, one of the objects in question in Moten's formula? Or think of the misunderstood, when even addressed at all, Islamic modernism of someone like Jalal Ali Ahmed, who argued against the parochial nature of European modernism while still holding out that new forms of literature, but also of life, politics, economy, society, could be fashioned in a rejection of an antinomy of an essentialized traditionalism and the erasing dominating capitalist modernity which had conjured it. One can find similar visions of these alternative modernisms dotted across the global south, and in those increasingly large pockets of global south and global north. Not simply in cultural practice or in the built form, the immediate ruin of our past is also dreams of what was once non-aligned movement for alternative modernisms from Lagos to Tehran, and to the unfulfilled promise of the new international economic order, proposed by the non-aligned states as a rather different way, a different alternative to the encapsulation and enclosure of the global world market that we live in today. But the built form is where you can imagine or feel the potentiality most directly. Upon seeing Split 3, the last of the great Yugoslavian public housing blocks in 1981, Jane Jacobs wrote, "Split 3 makes me feel so optimistic, thank you." Split 3 is less than 100 miles away from the Serafuddin White Mosque, but both are traces of a very real, very existent, different ideal of modernism. Split 3 stands as a brutalist refutation to both the conservative and liberal critiques of public housing. This is a quote from an architecture book. It's an exceptional achievement, the transformation of a modernist mass housing into a planned environment nevertheless marked by the diversity and spontaneity typical of a vital urban neighborhood. In many ways, Split 3 is the idealization of the design philosophy developed in Yugoslavia called the social standard, where neither market principle or party necessity guided the development, but rather a commitment that all people have access to housing, education, arts, and cultural goods. And in the Yugoslav case, in particular, the diversity of the possible expressions of those goods was part of the mode of their expression. The Serafuddin White Mosque, built as part of an overall dense town center, also included a public library and other community spaces, integrating an expansive sense of the social standard. The spiritual needs of the largely Muslim community were integrated into a design that was utterly modern and yet consonant with theological concepts from a Sunni Islamic tradition. In sharp distinction with, say, the postmodern excesses of contemporary Mecca, the White Mosque utilizes its modernist aesthetic to achieve an enhanced effect of communal spiritual seclusion. This is a quote from the same book. Only after a visitor makes a slow descent from street level to the subterranean level of the mosque, a descent which removes her not only from the chatter of the surrounding market, but also from her everyday preoccupations, can she fully appreciate the dignified austerity of the light-bathed interior. This space elevates, metaphorically, an Islamic spiritual ideal of contemplative and devotional seclusion through an utterly modernist aesthetic and ideal. My point with the examples, with raising the specter of modernism, is not, as some would have it, to underline how like a new urbanism will be the end-all, be-all of the Anthropocene. Not far from here, you can find examples of traditional North African agriculture, which are without question part of the portrait of a sustainable global human ecological niche. But rather than an eco-modernism, far different from the one usually presented, represents a kind of starting point for intervening in the structure of feeling that characterizes the long now. The desire for the future is often the lament of living postmodernism, capitalist realism, or just the accelerating daily exhaustion of the vast majority of people on this planet. The endless recycling of the themes and styles of what have defined capitalist modernity under the hegemonic certainty that there is no alternative, the endless personal and structural adjustment to the conditions of one's own exhaustion. The recession of temporal horizons in the long now is an opening up of political ones, not least the path to a new political imagination that the cruelest optimism would tell us we have to wait for. Even some who are trying to grasp the possibilities of this remain trapped not only with that ever-present Hegelian stepladder, but also mistake the aspiration to modernism with the material fantasies of some future as imagined by capitalist modernity. Capitalism as we know it, as we experience it and feel it, is unrealistic. Its fantasy life far from overabundant, decadent, or free, is stulted, pathetic, and limited. The concrete utopia for the long now presents not one single answer, but an enticing panoply of real possibilities for what a real modernism might present. It's not air conditioners versus asceticism. It's green prolocult, fantastic visions with Mughal clothing systems, local knowledges linked and spread. It is the desire for the future realized in creating a different, truly different world built from the materials and dreams, ecological and cultural, of the world we already live in. The ecological pulls the rug out from so much philosophy of history. It's not that the world is ending. It isn't. But rather that the end of the world is so perfect for so many of these theories, the apocalypse so sublime. What our thinking about time wasn't prepared for was for that world to change, for it to become not destroyed for everyone or forever and ever, amen, but just incredibly poorly organized for a whole lot of people. Whether time is cyclical or linear, progressive or regressive, it floated comfortably on a world where only at best the human bits changed. These ways of thinking are so deeply ingrained culturally and so frequently repackaged and so hegemonic in their congruity to existing power that they worm their way back into our thinking time and again, not only in thinking about the world, or rather our ecological niche within it, but also in some other concepts that have become suspiciously platonic over time: the economy, the state, capitalism itself. None of these things exist out of time. They have all changed, so much so as to hardly be recognizable. They don't have forms or heavenly bodies. We don't have 19th century states or 19th century markets. Why should we have the 19th century's past, present, and future? Cutting the fuse, pulling the brake, these Benjaminian metaphors for revolution are stopping the extractive circuit that lies as the parasitic center of our global human ecological niche. It is fundamentally and radically transforming that system. It is not inventing the future so much as building the present. It is a fight for time, a temporal freedom, a temporal luxury that stalks about a rather different eco-modernism. It is hard to say, even within the temporal parameters of something like the long now, that if that is truly socialism or merely managed capitalism. And these are merely abbreviated shorthands for the massive systems of social and ecological relations they encompass. The coordinates of this revolution do not turn on the metaphysics of alienation, nor on a redemptive justice. This revolution is not a way station on the road to the revolution, nor a step beyond it. It is entirely its own. It may very well be that something like the absolute overcoming of alienation, in the very strong sense in which so many propose it, could actually stand in the way of such a revolution. It turns out the vector of happiness has its own revolutionary needs. Like the Messianic, it is a political rupture, but to be simple, it is not the Messiah. The constellation one might see from this point of view of the angel of history is not the constellation of our rupture. For the time being, perhaps the better political theology is that of Imam Mahdi, the 12th Imam in the 12 Rashid tradition. That Messiah is not gone, merely in occultation. The messianic hope not overturned, abandoned, or overcome, simply in temporary abeyance, always there to remind us of yet another imaginable standard against which we can hold, critique, and transform the present. But the principles expressed in all these concepts, concrete utopia, no future, materialist history, messianic time, can still serve us in the long now. And this revolution, I would argue, for all its urgency and for all its departure from the messianic, is no less radiant. In Benjamin's view, the angel history sees what we cannot. We only catch a glimpse of the constellations the angel must see so clearly. The graphic picture of the long now shares in this. As with the angel, we see a great pile of debris that contains history that, like atmospheric carbon, never goes away. If we try, we can see the potent present possibilities hidden or submerged, but held back, rechanneled, and unfulfilled. But not only can we not see the whole picture, the messianic and the angel with it, even as analogy, are in abeyance. We grasp about as if in a maze. We are in the rubble, breathing the past, living the enemy's future already. But we can build from that rubble. We can steal pragmatism and realism from reigning powers, which are anything but pragmatic or realistic. All around us, we see a world shot through with the paradigm of Nawab Shah, a world where unexpectedly the literal grounds of history have shifted. But the longer we look, If we know where to look, in the distance between unrealistic realism and anti-utopian reality, we also begin to see a different constellation, those which correspond to a radical portrait of the present, of the possibilities latent in the present, waiting to be loosed from the fetters which hold them back today. This is the geometry of the long now, which we see, not splayed out on an imaginary coordinate plane pushing us into the future, but rather in biomes and built worlds and systems in our niche. And that dream, a world freed from exhaustion and arrayed and organized for human flourishing, is no cheat for revolutions or for messiahs. Better, at least as far as I am able to see, than the end of history or its beginning. It is truly otherworldly. While we all await the Imam, each in our own way, we may discover that we never really understood what the angel was looking at in the first place, what the Messiah is, or what it might bring. The dream world, held back not by technical limitation, but by political enervation, both from our sensuous ecological life and dream for the ruin, for the world, for the possibility of the long now, may prove, in all its earthly splendor, more attractive than heaven on earth could ever be. Thank you.